The contest ribbon was still folded in Mara Whitlock's coat pocket when she walked into the third town that had turned her away. Not turned her away because of her baking. Everyone agreed the honey wheat loaf was the finest thing that had crossed their tongues in years, and the ribbon they'd given her at the Callaway County Fair was proof of that, a small blue scrap of fabric that meant something and nothing at the same time. They'd turned her away because of everything else. The breadth of her shoulders, the way her dress strained across her hips, the particular kind of silence that fell over a room when Mara Whitlock walked through a door, which was not the silence of admiration but something closer to assessment, and what the people doing the assessing decided, invariably, was that she didn't fit. The boarding house in Callaway had been polite about it. The woman at the desk, thin, birch pale, with the kind of hands that had never kneaded dough a day in their lives, had looked Mara up and down once, and then informed her with a tight little smile that they were fully booked. This was a lie so obvious that even the cat sleeping on the window ledge seemed embarrassed by it. Mara had thanked the woman anyway. She'd learned that thanking people for their small cruelties confused them more than anger did, and she'd long since decided that leaving people confused was a reasonable form of revenge. The town of Haskell hadn't bothered with politeness. The cook at the diner, a heavy-set man who might have recognized a kindred spirit if he'd been built differently, had looked at her application for the kitchen position, looked at her, and told her they needed someone who could move quick between the tables. She'd pointed out that she was applying for kitchen work, not table service. He'd told her the position had been filled. She'd seen the help wanted sign still hanging in the window as she walked back up the main street. Millhaven had been the worst because it had offered the most hope. The bakery there, Sutton's, a real operation with a display case and a proper oven imported from the East, had sent her a letter after she'd entered their regional competition. "We would be delighted to consider you for a position," the letter said. "Please present yourself at your earliest convenience." She'd walked 4 days to get there. The woman behind the counter, who turned out to be Mrs. Sutton herself, had taken one look at Mara standing in the doorway with her competition ribbon and her worn-out traveling bag and had said, with the particular gentleness that is sometimes worse than cruelty, "We need someone the customers will enjoy looking at, you understand. It's not just about the bread." Mara had understood. She was 34 years old and had understood things like this her whole life. She walked out of Millhaven on a Tuesday in late September, when the sky had gone the color of old pewter and the wind coming down from the northern ridges had teeth in it. She had $11 and some change. She had a coat that was warm enough for early autumn, but wouldn't see her through a real winter. She had the ribbon still folded in her pocket, and she had the habit, carved into her by years of practice, of not letting herself think too far ahead, because thinking too far ahead on the frontier with $11 and no destination was the kind of thing that could hollow a person out from the inside. Her husband Edmund had died 2 years ago. Fever, quick and merciless, the kind that gave you 3 days of warning and then took everything. They'd had 7 years together on a small homestead outside of Dalton, years that were hard in the ordinary frontier ways, cold winters, bad harvests, the particular loneliness of land that demanded everything from you and sometimes gave nothing back. But Edmund had been a good man, not a perfect man. He had a temper that ran short when the money ran tight, and he'd had opinions about how a household ought to be ordered that Mara had not always agreed with. But he had seen her, had looked at her across a church social when she was 26, and still carrying the awkward self-consciousness of a woman who'd been told too many times that her size was a problem, and he had walked over and asked if she'd made the pie she was holding. She'd said yes. He'd asked if he could have a piece. She'd said he hadn't been invited to this social. He'd said he was inviting himself. She'd laughed, and that had been the beginning of something real. After he died, the homestead went to his brother, which was a legal matter she hadn't had the money or the energy to fight. She'd packed what she could carry and started moving. That was 2 years ago. In that time, she'd done laundry, kitchen work, mending, baking when anyone would let her, and she'd moved from place to place with the particular rhythm of a woman who has learned to travel light in every sense of the word. The road west from Millhaven was a dirt track that wound through dry grassland and the occasional stand of cottonwood trees. Mara walked it because it was the only road, and because walking was cheaper than riding, and because movement, at this point in her life, felt more honest than standing still. The afternoon light was slant and golden, the kind that made even hard country look briefly kind, and she was watching the shadows lengthen across the grass when she heard it. A sound. She stopped. The wind had died for a moment. They did that sometimes out here, just paused like they were thinking something over. And in that pause, she heard it again. Faint. From somewhere off the road, set back behind a dry creek bed in a line of dead scrub. A child crying. Mara stood there for a moment longer than she should have. She knew it. She was aware, even as she turned toward the sound, that she was doing the things she'd told herself she would stop doing, the picking up of things that weren't hers to carry. She'd done it her whole life, and it had cost her sleep and time and sometimes money she didn't have, and it had never once been convenient. But the crying didn't stop, and she had never in 34 years been able to walk past a sound like that without her feet turning toward it. She crossed the creek bed, stepping on stones that shifted under her weight, and pushed through the scrub. On the other side was a farmhouse. She nearly missed it at first, which told her something. The house sat low to the ground, made of timber that had gone gray with weather and neglect. One of the porch steps had collapsed entirely. The window on the left side of the door had a crack running diagonally across it, held together by what looked like dried clay packed into the gap. The fence that had probably once marked off a kitchen garden had fallen in sections, and the posts that remained stood at angles like tired old men. A barn sat further back, its doors closed, and she could hear the faint sound of livestock from inside it. Not many, but some. Goats, maybe. The crying was coming from inside the house. Mara walked up to the door and knocked. The sound stopped. A long pause, and then small footsteps, and the door opened a careful few inches. A girl looked up at her. 6 years old, maybe 7. Brown hair that had been braided some time ago and was now mostly unbraided, wisps of it stuck to her face. She was wearing a dress that had been hemmed up and taken in from something much larger, and she was holding a wooden spoon in one hand like she'd been interrupted in the middle of something. She looked at Mara without speaking. "I heard crying," Mara said. "Is everyone all right?" The girl continued to look at her. Her expression was not frightened exactly. It was assessing, in the way of children who've had to learn assessment early. "That was Noah," the girl said finally. "Is Noah hurt?" "He's hungry." The words came out flat, like a fact being reported. Not a plea, not an accusation, just information. Mara looked past her into the dim interior of the house. She could make out a rough table, 2 chairs that didn't match, a cold hearth, and on a blanket near the hearth, curled up small, a boy who was maybe 3 years old, his face flushed and streaked, his chest still hitching with the aftermath of crying. "Where's your mother?" Mara asked. The girl's face did something complicated. "She died," she said. "In the spring." Mara kept her voice level. "Your father?" "In the barn. He's been in the barn since morning." A pause. "He does that sometimes." She said it the way a much older person would say it. The way a person says something when they've been carrying it long enough that they've stopped feeling the weight. Mara looked at the girl for another moment. Then she said, "What's your name?" "Lena." "Lena, I'm Mara. Would it be all right if I came in and fixed something for Noah to eat?" Lena considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "Can you cook?" "Yes," Mara said. "I can." "We don't have much." "I know how to work with not much." Another pause. Then Lena stepped back from the door. Mian. The kitchen was cold in the particular way of rooms that hadn't had a fire in them for most of the day. Mara took stock without making a production of it. There were dried beans in a clay pot, some cornmeal, a heel of salt pork that was mostly fat but had enough meat to flavor something, half an onion on the windowsill that had gone papery on the outside but was still good within, 3 eggs in a cracked bowl. She found the kindling box, nearly empty, and the flint beside the hearth, and she got a fire going. The sound of it, the first crackle and catch of flame, made Noah lift his head from his blanket and watch with the fixed attention of a child who is too tired to move but not too tired to notice things. "Come here," Mara said to him, not waiting for permission, just holding out her hand in his direction and letting him decide. He stared at her hand for a long moment. Then he got up off the blanket, crossed the floor in his sock feet, and put his small fingers into her palm. His hands were cold. "Sit up here," she said, lifting him onto the end of the table, where he sat swinging his feet and watching her work with the focused attention children give to things that interest them. Lena sat at the other end of the table, still holding her wooden spoon, watching. Mara put the beans on to boil, cut the salt pork into the smallest pieces she could manage, found a pot for the cornmeal. She didn't talk while she worked. There was something in the quality of the children's attention that told her they were not used to a lot of talk from adults, and she wasn't going to perform at them when they were already tired. She just cooked. After a while, Noah said, "Are you a traveler?" "I am," Mara said. "Where are you going?" She thought about it. "I'm not entirely sure," she said, which was more honesty than she usually gave to that question. But he was 3 years old, and he'd asked it straight, and she figured he deserved a straight answer. "We used to have a dog," Noah said. "He ran away." "That's hard," Mara said. "Papa said he probably found somewhere better." Mara didn't say anything to that. The smell of the beans and salt pork had begun to fill the kitchen, that particular smell of something simple being made into something warm. And she saw Noah's nose twitch toward it, and then a small, involuntary smile cross his face that she suspected he had forgotten he was capable of. She was ladling portions into bowls when the door opened. The man who came in was taller than the door frame wanted to allow, and he bent his head without thinking about it, which told her he'd been ducking that door frame for years. He was somewhere north of 30, dark-haired, with a beard that had gone past deliberate and into neglected, and the particular drawn look of a person who had been sleeping badly for months. His clothes were work clothes, heavy canvas pants and a wool shirt, and they were clean in the way of things washed without much care for anything except basic function. He stopped when he saw Mara, not in a startled way, in the way of a man who has used up most of his capacity for reaction and has very little left for surprise. He looked at her. He looked at his children. He looked at the fire in the hearth and the bowls on the table. "Who are you?" he said. "Mara Whitlock. I was passing on the road and heard Noah crying. Lena let me in." She kept her voice even. She was not going to apologize for being in his kitchen. She was, in fact, feeding his children, and she was not going to apologize for that. He looked at Lena. "I said she could come in," Lena said. "She knows how to cook." Something moved across his face. Not quite guilt, not quite relief. Something between them that didn't have a clean name. "Gideon Mercer," he said. He crossed the room in 3 strides and sat down at the table across from his children. Not because he'd been invited, because his legs had apparently decided they were done holding him up. Mara set a bowl in front of him without being asked. He looked at it. He looked at her. He said, "You don't have to do this." "I know," she said. "The beans were already soaking. It would have been a waste." This was not entirely true. The beans had been soaking because whoever had started them soaking had not come back to finish the job, but it was true enough to serve. He ate. Noah ate, carefully at first, and then with the focused determination of a small child who has discovered hunger. Lena ate with a kind of measured care that Mara recognized as the eating of someone who has learned to be uncertain about where the next meal is coming from. Nobody talked much. The fire crackled. The light outside the windows had gone the deep orange of late afternoon. When the bowls were empty, Gideon sat back in his chair and looked at her. He had some color in his face now that hadn't been there before. "Where are you headed?" he said. "West, generally," Mara said. "I don't have a specific destination." "You have kin out west?" "No." He nodded slowly. "Work, then." "Looking for it." Another silence. Noah had climbed down from his end of the table and dragged his blanket to a spot near the hearth, where he was now sitting with his knees pulled up, watching the fire. Lena was washing the bowls in the basin with the mechanical competence of a child who has been doing adult tasks long enough that they've stopped being impressive. "Lena," Mara said quietly. The girl looked up. "I can do those." Lena looked at her for a moment. Then slowly, she stepped back from the basin and wiped her hands on her dress. She didn't look relieved. She looked like someone who had been carrying something heavy for so long that she was no longer sure she'd know how to put it down. Mara washed the bowls. She could feel Gideon watching her, but she didn't look at him. She had been looked at her entire life by people trying to figure out what category she fell into. She had long since learned to let people look until they ran out of looking. and then to simply keep doing whatever she'd been doing. When the bowls were done, she set them to dry and turned around. "I'll stay the night. If you have a corner I can sleep in," she said to Gideon. "In the morning, I'll be on my way." He didn't answer immediately. He looked at his children. Noah asleep now against the blanket, Lena sitting at the table with her wooden spoon and the expression of someone much older than 6. And then he looked at Mara. "I don't have much to offer a guest," he said. "I don't need much," Mara said. "I told you, I know how to work with not much." She slept in what had once been a storage room off the kitchen, on a pallet she made from folded grain sacks and her own traveling blanket. It wasn't comfortable. She'd slept on worse. In the early morning, before the house woke up, she got the fire going again and started the rest of the cornmeal into porridge. She found a small cache of dried apples in a tin on the high shelf, overlooked, maybe, or saved for something, and she cut them up and stirred them in. She told herself she'd leave after breakfast. She was still telling herself this when Lena appeared in the kitchen doorway in her nightgown, her hair worse than it had been the night before, and stopped. "You're still here," Lena said. "Finishing breakfast," Mara said. Lena crossed the kitchen floor in her bare feet. She stood beside Mara at the hearth and looked at the pot. She didn't say anything. After a moment, "My mama used to put dried apples in." Mara didn't stop stirring. "Did she?" "Yes." Another pause. "I forgot that she did that." Mara glanced sideways at the girl. 6 years old, maybe 7, standing there in her nightgown with her hair coming apart, looking at a pot of porridge and trying to hold on to a memory that was already getting thinner at the edges. Mara said nothing. She kept stirring, but she did not leave after breakfast. She told herself she'd leave by midday, and then midday came and she'd started the bread because there was flour she'd found in a sack at the back of the larder. Not a lot, but enough. And she was not going to leave bread half-started. She told herself she'd leave after the bread, and then while the bread was baking, Noah asked if she could help him find where his sock had gone. It had apparently been missing for several days, and she found it under the edge of the broken porch step. Gideon came in from the barn at noon and found her patching a tear in the window curtain with thread she'd found in a small basket near the window. "I thought you were leaving," he said. "I'm leaving," she said. "After I finish this." He stood there in the doorway for a moment. He looked like a man who wanted to say something and didn't know what it was yet. "The bread smells good," he said finally. "It'll be ready in about 20 minutes, Mara said. He nodded. He went back outside. She finished the curtain and then she sat back and looked at the room around her. The fire, the mended curtain, the bread working its slow magic in the iron Dutch oven. Through the interior doorway, she could hear Noah talking to himself in the particular stream of consciousness narrative that very small children conduct when they think no one is paying attention. And she could hear Lena's quieter voice, occasionally interjecting. Mara had intended to leave this morning. She'd been intending to leave all day. She sat there for a moment longer, listening to the children. The fire popped. The bread smell was enough to make you believe, very briefly, that things could be all right. She got up and started cutting the dried beans she'd seen soaking in a different pot. Someone had started them last night, probably Lena, with the grim persistence of a child trying to keep things running, into tonight's supper. She was going to leave. Just not yet. Because she had learned in 34 years that there is a difference between walking away from something and running from it, and she had made a rule for herself. She would not run. She would walk away when she was ready, and she would do it clean, and she would not leave things half-finished or cold on the stove, or children listening for her footsteps when they should be listening for nothing more demanding than the sound of their own voices. Outside, the afternoon light slid across the broken fence and the gray timber walls, and made everything look a little more survivable than it actually was. Mara cut the beans. She listened to the children. She stayed. She stayed 3 days before anyone said anything about it. That was how it worked out here. People on the frontier had a practical relationship with necessity, and the necessity of the situation at the Mercer place was clear enough that even Gideon, who was not a man given to accepting things easily, didn't push the question of when she was leaving. The children needed feeding, the house needed tending, and Mara was there, doing both, without being asked and without making a production of it. That was enough to buy 3 days of silence on the subject. On the 4th morning, Gideon found her in the barn before sunrise. She'd been up since before dawn. She always was. It was a habit from the homestead years that she'd never managed to shake. And she'd discovered that the goats, two of them, had been getting out through a gap in the lower section of the barn wall, where a board had warped and pulled loose from its nail. She was on her knees in the straw with a hammer she'd found hanging on a peg near the door, working the board back into position. Gideon stopped in the doorway. The light was gray and early, and she could feel him looking at her without turning around. "That board's been loose since August," he said. "I can see that," Mara said. She drove the nail home. It wasn't a perfect fix. The wood had swelled and the grain was wrong, but it would hold through winter if nobody put too much weight on it. "You've got a second one going on the south wall," she added. "I can get to that this afternoon." He was quiet for a moment. She could hear him breathing, slow and deliberate, the way a man breathes when he's deciding how to say something. "You don't have to do that," he said. She sat back on her heels and looked at him over her shoulder. "I know. I mean it. You've already done more than—" "Gideon." She said his name the way you say a word when you want someone to stop and hear you. "I'm fixing your barn wall. It doesn't require a speech." He looked at her for another long moment. Then he crossed the barn, picked up the feed bucket from its hook, and started filling it from the grain sack without another word. They worked together in silence for a while, the goats moving around them with the resigned acceptance of animals that have learned humans are mostly unpredictable but occasionally useful. After a few minutes, he said, "How long are you planning to stay?" "I haven't decided," Mara said. She was checking the water trough, which was low. "Does it matter?" "It matters to the children," he said. He said it quietly, without accusation, but it landed the way he'd meant it to. "Lena, especially. She doesn't—" He stopped. Started again. "She doesn't let people in easy, not since her mother. And she's let you in." Mara found the water bucket and went to fill it from the pump outside. She thought about what he'd said while she was pumping, the cold water coming up slow in the early morning chill. "I'm not going to promise you something I can't guarantee," she said when she came back in. "That wouldn't be fair to either of us. But I'm not leaving today. And I'm not the kind of person who disappears without warning." He looked at her steadily. He had the kind of eyes that had probably been easier to look at once, before whatever the last year had done to him. "All right," he said. That was all. "All right." They finished the morning chores, and she went inside to get breakfast started, and he stayed in the barn longer than the chores required, which was something she'd already noticed he did. The barn was the place he went when the house was too much. She understood that. She didn't take it personally. The days settled into a shape that surprised her with how quickly it felt normal. Mornings were hers by default. She was always up first, fire going before anyone else stirred, and by the time Lena appeared in the kitchen doorway, the porridge was usually on and the kitchen had lost its overnight chill. She'd learned within the first few days that Lena was a child who needed a few minutes to become herself in the morning, needed to stand near the warmth and not be asked anything. And so Mara gave her that. Just let her stand there. Didn't talk at her or put anything in her hands. Just let the morning happen. Noah was the opposite. Noah woke up ready to negotiate. "What are we having?" was usually the first thing out of his mouth. Before he'd even fully crossed the kitchen threshold, his hair sticking up in 3 directions and his sock situation always precarious. "Porridge," Mara would say. "With the apples?" "If there are apples." "Can we look for apples?" "We looked yesterday." "But maybe there are more today." She'd taken him out twice to look for the dried apple tin she'd found on the high shelf, which was now empty, and both times he'd approached the search with the gravity of a small person convinced that apples might materialize in places they hadn't been yesterday. She admired this about him. She did not tell him so because she suspected telling a 3-year-old you admire their persistence only encouraged increasingly creative persistence. Lena was harder to read. She was a child who had been doing adult work for so long that she'd developed a kind of armor around it, a competence that she wore like something she needed to protect. She knew where everything was in the house, knew which floorboards creaked and which ones didn't, knew how to manage Noah's particular anxieties, and which of his moods were just tiredness and which were actual distress. She'd been running this household in her 6-year-old way since her mother had died, and she did not immediately relinquish this role just because Mara was there. The first friction came over the cornbread. Mara had been making cornbread most mornings. A simple thing, nothing elaborate, just meal and salt and a scrape of lard and whatever else there was to add. On the fifth day, she came into the kitchen to find Lena already at the table with the cornmeal sack, measuring out quantities with the focused seriousness of a child who had been shown the recipe once and was determined to reproduce it perfectly. Mara stood in the doorway and watched her for a moment. "You want to make it?" she said. Lena didn't look up. "I know how. I can see that. Mama showed me." She said it without looking up, not as a challenge, as a fact she was holding carefully. Mara came into the kitchen and sat down at the table across from her. She didn't take the sack or the measuring cup or any of it. She just sat. "Then you make it," Mara said. "I'll watch. Tell me if I can help." Lena looked up at that. She'd been expecting something else. Instruction, probably, or the kind of cheerful takeover that adults performed when they thought children were doing things wrong. She looked at Mara with the expression of someone who'd been braced for an impact that hadn't come. "You'll just watch?" she said. "Unless you need something." A pause. Then Lena went back to measuring. She did know how. She had the proportions roughly right, and what was slightly off, the lard, which she'd used a bit too much of, Mara said nothing about, because the cornbread would be fine, just a little richer, and fine was more important than correct right now. What mattered was that Lena made it, and when it came out of the Dutch oven and Noah tasted it and said, around a mouthful, "This is good," Lena sat up a little straighter and glanced across at Mara. Mara said, "It is good. You've got a better hand with the lard than I do." This was not entirely true, but it was true enough that it counted. By the end of the second week, the house had changed in ways that were hard to articulate but impossible to miss. The kitchen table had been scrubbed down until the grain showed through the old staining. The window curtains, both of them now mended, let in the afternoon light cleanly instead of in the dull, muffled way they had before. The broken porch step had been replaced. Mara had found good lumber in the back of the barn, and Gideon had cut it to size without being asked, which was the closest he'd come to participating in the household's renovation. The gap in the south barn wall had been patched. The water barrel had been moved to a better position under the eave, where it caught rain instead of just sitting there getting dusty. None of these things were large. All of them together added up to something that felt different in the bones of the place, like a house that had been holding its breath and had started, cautiously, to exhale. Noah had taken to following Mara around in the mornings with the dedication of a small satellite maintaining orbit. He didn't always talk. Sometimes he just walked where she walked, stood where she stood, watched what she was doing with the patient attention of a child storing things up. She'd gotten used to the small weight of him beside her, the way he'd tuck his hand into the side of her skirt, when something puzzled him, his running commentary on everything he observed. "That chicken doesn't like you," he informed her one afternoon, watching from a safe distance as Mara dealt with the single hen that lived in a separate small enclosure attached to the barn. "She doesn't like anyone," Mara said, moving carefully. "She liked Mama a little." Animals have their preferences. "Papa says she's mean." "Your papa is not wrong about everything," Mara said, and Noah laughed, which surprised them both. Gideon, for his part, was present in the way a man is present when he has not yet decided what to do with something. He ate what was put in front of him. He did his barn work, his fencing checks, the 100 small labors of keeping a place running on minimal resources. He didn't talk much at meals, but he'd started staying at the table a little longer after eating instead of retreating immediately, and Mara had learned that this was, for Gideon Mercer, a significant thing. He was not a bad man. She'd known that within the first few days. He was a man who had taken a loss that was too big for the container of him and hadn't figured out yet how to refit himself around it. He'd loved his wife. That was clear not in anything he said, but in the gaps where the things he didn't say lived. In the way he sometimes went quiet for stretches that had nothing to do with the conversation, was somewhere else entirely for a moment before he came back. In the way Lena sometimes looked at him with an expression that was too knowing for a 6-year-old and was partly love and partly the particular sorrow of a child who has watched a parent become someone they don't entirely recognize. One evening, after the children were in bed, Mara was mending a pair of Noah's trousers at the kitchen table when Gideon came in from outside and sat down across from her. He didn't say anything. He just sat there, and she kept mending, and the fire did its work. After a while, he said, "Clara, my wife, she used to sit like that, at night, after the kids were down." Mara looked up. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the middle distance, somewhere between the table and the wall. She'd mend things, he said, or she'd just sit. She liked the quiet after they were in bed. He stopped. I haven't been able to stand that quiet since she died. That specific quiet. Mara didn't say she was sorry. She'd learned that sorry, offered too quickly, sometimes just put a door between people. Instead, she said, "What was she like?" He looked at her then, a little surprised, like the question wasn't what he'd expected. "Stubborn," he said after a moment. "More stubborn than anyone I've ever known. She'd make up her mind about something, and there was no point in arguing because she'd already done the arguing herself, in her head, before you even got started." A pause, and something in his face changed. Not quite a smile, but in the neighborhood of one. She was funny. People didn't always see it because she was quiet. But she was funny in that way where you'd be in the middle of something serious and she'd say one thing and you'd have to leave the room. "Lena has that," Mara said. He looked at her again. "Yeah," he said after a moment. "She does." They sat in the quiet after that, and it was a different kind of quiet than the one he'd described. Not the after-presence of someone gone, just two people in a warm kitchen with the fire dying down, which was its own kind of ordinary, the kind that didn't ask anything of you. It was on a Tuesday, the third week, when the neighbor came. Mara had been in the kitchen garden, what was left of it, which was mainly the structure and the memory of productivity, trying to assess what could be salvaged before the cold set in. She was on her knees turning over a section of soil when she heard a horse on the road and looked up to see a woman riding in through the gate. The woman was somewhere past 50, sharp-featured, with the upright posture of someone who had strong opinions about posture. She was dressed well for the frontier, which meant her clothes were plain, but the fabric was good. She reined up near the fence and looked at Mara with an expression that didn't bother hiding its calculation. "Is Gideon Mercer in?" she said. "He's in the barn," Mara said. She got to her feet and dusted her knees. "I can get him if you like, Mrs. Helper," the woman said. "I live 3 miles north. I've been coming out to check on the Mercer place since Clara died." She was still looking at Mara with that calculating look. "I don't believe I've seen you before." "I've been here 3 weeks, Mara said. 3 weeks. A pause. "And who are you to them?" It was a reasonable question, asked in an unreasonable way. Mara held her ground. "I'm Mara Whitlock. I was traveling through. I've been helping with the household. Mrs. Halper's expression went through several adjustments too quickly to track cleanly. "Helping," she said. The word had things packed into it. "Helping," Mara confirmed. Gideon must have heard the horse because he came out of the barn before Mara had to go get him. He took in the situation in a glance. Mrs. Halper on her horse, Mara standing at the garden fence, and something tightened around his eyes. "Evelyn," he said, "didn't know you were coming out." "I go where I see need," Mrs. the Halper said pleasantly. "I heard in town you'd taken on some help. I wanted to see how the children were faring." "They're faring well," Gideon said. His voice was even and gave nothing. Mrs. Halper looked from him to Mara and back again. "I'd like to see them, if it's all right." She said if it's all right in the tone of someone for whom it would be equally all right, regardless of the answer. Gideon let her in, which was the frontier equivalent of choosing the battle you were willing to fight later rather than now. Mara went back to the garden and kept working. She could hear faintly the sound of voices from inside the house, and then after about 20 minutes the front door opened and Mrs. Halper came back out. She mounted her horse with the neat efficiency of a woman who'd been doing it for decades, and then she paused at the gate and looked at Mara. "The children seem well," she said, in a tone that conceded something without acknowledging it was a concession. "They are," Mara said. A pause. "You plan to stay on long?" "I haven't made plans either way." Mrs. Halper looked at her for another moment. "These children have had enough disruption," she said. "What they don't need is getting attached to someone who's going to move on." Mara looked at her steadily. "I appreciate the concern," she said. "But," said Mrs. Halper, sensing there was one. "But I'm not sure that's your call," Mara said. Not unkindly, just as a fact being reported. Mrs. Halper held her gaze for a moment longer. then clucked to her horse and rode back up the road. Mara watched her go. She wasn't angry. She was tired in the old familiar way of a woman who had been assessed by strangers her entire life and had learned to feel the assessment without being undone by it. Gideon came out of the house and stood on the porch. "Sorry about that," he said. "Don't be," Mara said. "She's not wrong about the disruption." "She's not entirely right either," he said. He said it quietly, looking not at her, but at the road where Mrs. Halper had gone. Then he went back inside. Mara turned back to the garden and went on digging. The whispers started the week after. She knew about them before anyone said anything to her directly, because she'd been living in the social world long enough to know how these things moved. She could tell by the way the Halper boy, who came by sometimes on an errand for his mother, looked at the house differently than he had before. She could tell by the way Gideon came home from the feed store one afternoon with a particular kind of quiet on him, the kind that wasn't tiredness, but something he was processing alone. She asked him about it that evening after supper, when Lena was working on some letters Mara had started teaching her, and Noah was asleep. "Something happened in town?" she said. He was quiet for a moment too long. "People talk," he said. "What are they saying?" He looked uncomfortable. He picked up his coffee cup, put it down. "That I've got a stranger living in my house. That it looks improper." "Does it bother you?" she asked. He thought about it genuinely, which she appreciated. He wasn't the kind of man who gave automatic answers. "No," he said, "not in the way they mean it. But it makes things harder for you, I imagine. In town." "I don't go to town," she said. "You'll need to eventually." She looked at him across the table. "Is that your way of telling me there's going to be a problem when I do?" He held her gaze. "I'm telling you, people have made up their minds about the situation based on what they think they see. And I can't—" He stopped. "I can't stop people from talking. I can only tell you what they're saying isn't my concern." "All right," she said. Lena had looked up from her letters during this exchange. She was following it with the focused attention she brought to things she wasn't sure she was supposed to be hearing. "People in town are mean sometimes," she said. Neither Mara nor Gideon had a good answer for this, because it was true. "Some people," Mara said. "Not all." "Mrs. Halper is mean," Lena said. "Mrs. Halper is worried," Mara said. "That's a different thing. Sometimes they look the same." Lena considered this with the seriousness she gave to most things. "Is she worried about us?" "I think so," Mara said. In her way. "You're better at worrying about us," Lena said. She said it the way you say a thing that is simply true and doesn't require decoration, and then she went back to her letters. Gideon looked at Mara across the table. Something in his face had shifted, something that was partly gratitude and partly something harder to name. The specific look of a man watching his daughter reach toward something she'd stopped reaching for months ago. Mara looked back at her own hands on the table. Outside, the wind had picked up, the first real cut of autumn in it, and she could hear it moving around the corners of the house. The house was not quiet the way it had been when she arrived. It had a different sound to it now. Not loud, not festive, nothing so dramatic as that. Just occupied. In a way, a house feels occupied when the people in it are actually present to each other. She thought about Mrs. Halper. She thought about the whispers in town. She thought about the particular arithmetic of her situation. A widow, no home, no clear destination, living in a widower's house on the edge of nowhere. She knew how it looked. She'd always known how things looked from the outside, because the outside had always been where she'd spent most of her time, watching things from a distance and being watched in return. What she hadn't expected, when she'd heard a child crying through an open window on a September afternoon, was that the inside of something might feel different from what she'd imagined. She didn't say that to Gideon. She wasn't ready to say it, and she was pretty sure he wasn't ready to hear it. She got up and put another log on the fire, and the warmth pushed back against the cold coming through the walls, and she listened to Lena reading her letters aloud in a soft, careful voice, sounding out the shapes of words she was only just learning to trust. And she stood there by the fire and was still. The trip to town had been Gideon's idea, which was the first thing that should have told Mara it wasn't going to go the way either of them planned. He'd brought it up on a Wednesday morning while she was straining the goat milk, standing in the barn doorway with his hat in his hands, the way he stood when he was going to say something he'd been thinking about for a while. "I need to go into Haskell on Friday," he said. "Pick up feed, check on an order I put in at the dry goods. You could come if you wanted, get whatever you need. Mara kept working. I don't need much." "You've been here nearly a month," he said. "You haven't been off the property once." "I've been busy." "Mara." He said her name in that deliberate way. The way she'd started to recognize meant he was going to say the thing underneath the thing. "Come to town. The children will be fine for a few hours. Mrs. Briggs next over said she'd look in on them." She looked at him over her shoulder. He looked back at her steadily, which was something he'd gotten better at over the past few weeks, looking at her steadily instead of at the middle distance or the floor. "All right," she said. "Friday." She spent the next 2 days not thinking about it, which was its own kind of thinking about it. She knew what Haskell was like. She'd passed through it on her way west, had applied at the diner, had seen the help wanted sign still in the window as she walked away. She knew the dimensions of the place. 2 streets of any consequence, a feed store, a dry goods, a saloon that tried to be respectable and mostly failed, a church, and the particular social architecture of a small frontier town where everyone knew everyone else's business and had opinions about it. She knew also what walking into Haskell beside Gideon Mercer was going to look like. She'd had a month to think about that, listening to the whispers come home with him after his supply runs, reading them in the careful way he didn't mention certain things. But she'd said all right, and she wasn't going to unsay it. Friday came cold and clear, the sky a hard blue with the first real suggestion of winter in the light. Gideon hitched the wagon while Mara made sure the children had enough to keep them occupied, and Mrs. Briggs, a comfortable woman in her 60s who asked no questions and had the capable manner of someone who'd raised 7 children and was unimpressed by most crises, had settled herself in the kitchen with her knitting. "Don't let Noah feed the chicken," Mara told Lena. "Why?" "Because last time he decided she needed a name and spent the rest of the day calling her Margaret. And I don't want to have that conversation again." Lena's mouth did the thing it did sometimes now. Not quite a smile, but in the direction of one. "I'll watch him." "I know you will." Mara paused. "But you don't have to, Lena. That's what Mrs. Briggs is here for. You can just be." Lena looked at her with that old expression, the one that was too measured for a child her age. "Be what?" "7, Mara said. "Just be 7. She climbed up onto the wagon seat beside Gideon and they headed down the road toward Haskell, the wheels cutting through the frost-stiffened mud of the track. They didn't talk much on the ride in. Gideon wasn't a man who felt the need to fill silence, which was something she'd come to appreciate. The country moved past them. Dry grass, bare cottonwoods, the occasional hawk hanging in the cold air. And she sat with her hands in her lap and let the distance pass. Haskell announced itself the way small towns did. A water tower, a cluster of rooftops, the smell of horses and smoke. Gideon guided the wagon down the main street, and she felt, as she always did when she came into a place like this, the particular adjustment her body made. A slight squaring of the shoulders, a careful settling of the face into something that didn't invite comment. He tied up the wagon in front of the feed store and helped her down, which was something he'd started doing without making anything of it, offering a hand as a matter of course, not as a performance. She'd stopped arguing with it. "I need about an hour here," he said. "You want to meet at the dry goods after?" "That's fine," she said. She walked up the main street toward the dry goods, and she felt the town notice her the way a town notices a stranger when a stranger has already become a topic of conversation. It was in the particular way people's eyes tracked, the slight pauses in conversations on the boardwalk, the woman outside the milliner's who said something behind her hand to the woman beside her as Mara passed. She went into the dry goods. She needed thread, a new mending needle. Hers had snapped 2 days ago. And she wanted to look at whether there was any decent flour that wasn't the gritty, low-grade stuff the ranch's supply had run to. The man behind the counter, a young fellow with a sparse mustache he was clearly working very hard on, helped her without incident. She made her purchases, thanked him, and went back outside. That was where it started. There were 4 of them on the boardwalk outside the dry goods. She didn't know any of them, which meant they knew her through the version of her that small-town gossip had assembled. The large woman living at the Mercer place, the traveling woman who'd inserted herself into a widower's house, the subject of Mrs. Halper's concern. The one who spoke first was a man in his 50s with a red face and the settled look of someone who considered himself important in the particular way of men who've decided their opinions are public property. He was speaking to the woman beside him, his wife, Mara guessed, from the resigned expression on her face. But he pitched his voice to Carrie. "That's the one Halper was talking about," he said. "Can see why she's worried. Poor Mercer must be desperate, taking that in." The woman beside him made a small sound, not exactly a contradiction, but not quite agreement either. The sound of someone who wanted no part of what was coming but didn't know how to step out of it. The second man, younger, leaned against the wall. "She set herself up real cozy, from what I hear." "Not hard to see what she's after," the first man said, and he looked directly at Mara now. The pretense of talking around her dropped. He looked at her the way certain men looked at women they'd decided didn't deserve the performance of ordinary courtesy. A look that was calculated and entirely comfortable with itself. Mara stopped walking. She had a choice here, and she knew it, and she took the half-second she needed to make it. She'd been in this position before. She would be in it again. The options were walk past, which would be smart and would cost her something she wouldn't get back, or stop. She stopped. She looked at the man directly. "I didn't catch your name," she said. He blinked. He hadn't expected her to stop. People who expected to be walked past were generally thrown when you didn't walk past. "Harlan Coe," he said, after a moment. He said it like it was supposed to mean something. "Mr. Coe," Mara said. "I don't know you and you don't know me. What you've been told about me is someone else's version of things. I'm not going to stand here and argue it with you because I don't have any particular interest in your opinion, but I'll tell you this once. Those children are fed and warm and cared for, and that's more than they were before I came. If that's what you're calling desperate, I'll take it." The silence on the boardwalk had the quality of something drawn tight. Harlan Coe's face had gone a deeper red. He looked at her with something that had moved past amusement into the colder territory of a man who doesn't like being spoken to in a way he hasn't sanctioned. "You've got a mouth on you," he said, and the words were meant to diminish her. "I do," Mara said. "It served me well." She turned and walked up the boardwalk and didn't look back because looking back would have cost her more than not looking back. Her hands inside her coat pockets were shaking, not from fear, from the effort of keeping her voice level when her whole body had been screaming at her to say something she couldn't take back. She found Gideon at the wagon. He was loading the feed sacks, and he looked up when she approached, and something in her face must have shown because he straightened up and said, "What happened?" "Nothing I haven't handled," she said. He looked at her for another moment. "Harlan Coe." She looked at him. "You know him." "Everyone knows Harlan Coe." His jaw had tightened. "What did he say?" "Nothing original," she said. "Gideon, don't." "Don't what?" "Don't go do something that makes this larger than it needs to be." He stood there with a feed sack over one shoulder, and the particular tightness of a man who wanted to do something and was deciding whether the cost was worth it. After a long moment, he put the sack in the wagon. "He has no right," Gideon said. "No," Mara agreed. "He doesn't. That's never stopped people before, and it won't stop them now." He helped her up onto the wagon seat, and they drove back through the main street, and she kept her eyes on the road ahead and felt the town's attention slide off them as they passed out of it. They were a mile down the road when he said, "I'm sorry." "Don't apologize for things you didn't do," she said. "I brought you there. I chose to go." She looked at the road ahead. "And I'm not sorry I went. I'm just sorry it went the way it did." He drove. The horse's breath made small clouds in the cold air. After another mile, he said, "You didn't deserve that." "No," she said. "I didn't." He didn't say anything else, and she didn't either, and the silence between them wasn't comfortable exactly, but it was honest, which at this point she preferred. That night, after supper, after the children were in bed, Gideon sat at the kitchen table for a long time without moving toward the door to the barn. That was different. Mara washed the supper dishes and set them to dry and was sitting down with her mending when he finally said, "I need to say something." She looked at him. His hands were flat on the table, and he was looking at them. "All right," she said. He looked up. "What happened today? What's What's been happening in town, the talk, it's going to keep happening. I know how it is out here. People have made up their mind about what this looks like, and they're not going to change it. He paused. But I can do something about the part of it that's causing you the most harm. Mara set down her mending slowly. She was not sure where this was going, and she'd learned to be careful about where things went when she wasn't sure. What I mean to say, Gideon said, and his voice was careful in the way of a man who has rehearsed something and is now realizing the rehearsal wasn't sufficient, is that if you had a name, my name, it would stop most of the talk. People couldn't say what they're saying if it wasn't true. The kitchen was very quiet. The fire ticked in the hearth. Outside, the wind moved around the corners of the house. "You're asking me to marry you," Mara said. She made it a statement because she wanted to be absolutely sure they were talking about the same thing. "I'm asking if you'd consider it," he said. He still had his hands flat on the table. He looked, she thought, like a man bracing for something. I know I'm not offering what a woman would want to be offered. I know what this is and what it isn't, but you'd be protected, legally, socially. The children, Gideon," she said. He stopped. She took a breath. She looked at him across the table, and she thought about the months she'd spent here. The bread, and the mending, and the cold mornings, and Lena's careful face, and Noah's hand tucked into her skirt. She thought about Harlan Coe on the boardwalk, and Mrs. Halper on her horse, and the woman with the tight little smile at the Callaway boarding house, and every other person who had looked at her and made an assessment and decided she needed to be managed. She thought about Edmund, who had asked if he could have a piece of her pie, and whom she had loved. "No," she said. Gideon went very still. "I won't marry you because it would make people stop talking," she said. "That's not a reason to marry someone. Not for you and not for me." "I understand," he said. His voice had gone flat in the careful way of a man who is managing something. "If you're worried I'd expect things, it's not that," she said. "Gideon, stop. Let me finish." He stopped. "I don't need your name to make what I'm doing here worth something," she said. "I don't need Harlan Coe to think I'm respectable. I don't need Mrs. Halper to approve of me. I'm here because your children needed someone and I chose to stay. That's the whole of it. A marriage certificate doesn't change what I am to them or what I am to myself. And I'll be honest with you. The idea of taking on a name just to make a man in town feel better about what he sees makes me want to walk out that door and not come back." Something moved across Gideon's face. It was complicated, and she didn't try to read all of it. "And I'm not saying this to embarrass you," she said, more quietly. "I know why you said it. I know you were trying to do something good. But the way you said it, it would protect you. Like, I'm a problem that needs a solution." She stopped herself, steadied. "I'm not a problem. I know that," he said. "Do you?" He looked at her for a long moment, then he said, "Yes, I do." He said it without the defensive edge she'd half expected, just plainly, like a fact. She nodded. She picked up her mending again, though she wasn't looking at it. The fire crackled. She could feel Gideon still sitting there across the table, and she could feel the weight of what they'd just said to each other, which was heavier than the conversation itself and would take some time to settle. "I'm not saying never," she said finally, to the mending in her hands. She hadn't planned to say it. She said it because it was true, and because she'd never been able to make herself say things that weren't. "I'm saying not like this. Not for that reason." He was quiet for so long that she looked up. He was looking at the table, but there was something in his face that was different from the drawn, locked expression he'd been wearing since the first night she'd walked in here, something that had come loose a little. "All right," he said. "Just all right." Same as he'd said it in the barn that first morning when she'd told him she wasn't leaving today. She went back to her mending. He stayed at the table, which he'd been doing more often lately, and they sat in the kitchen while the fire burned down, and it was almost ordinary, the two of them sitting there, except that nothing between them had been ordinary for the past few weeks and was likely to become less ordinary before it became more. She started thinking about leaving the following afternoon, not because of the proposal, not exactly, but it had done something to the way she was looking at things, cracked something open that she'd been keeping carefully shut, and what came out of that crack wasn't what she'd expected. She was hanging laundry on the line in the cold afternoon, her own clothes among the family's, which she'd stopped noticing weeks ago, when it hit her with the particular clarity that uncomfortable things have when they arrive without warning. She had made herself essential here. Not useful, essential. And there was a difference. Useful was hanging laundry. Essential was that Lena now looked for her in the kitchen every morning before looking for her father. Essential was that Noah called her name when he woke in the night scared instead of calling for Gideon. Essential was that the house ran on a rhythm she'd built from scratch, and if she left tomorrow it would not just be inconvenient, it would be another loss, stacked on top of the losses these children had already accumulated. She had done that. She had walked in here for one meal, and she had made herself the axis of this household. And she hadn't done it on purpose, and she hadn't done it for anything except because the children needed it, and she was incapable of leaving things undone. But intention didn't change consequence. The wind came across the yard and snapped the sheet she was holding, and she stood there with it in her hands and thought about what she was. She was a woman who had been turned away from every door she'd knocked on, and then she had walked through one that was open, and now she was so far inside it that she couldn't see the door anymore. And there was a man in that house who had tried to solve the problem of her by offering his name, which she'd refused, and which had been the right thing to refuse, but which had also made her feel for the first time in a month like she was something that needed to be solved. She was a burden. She could see it clearly now in the cold afternoon light, the laundry snapping around her in the wind. She had convinced herself she was helping, and she was. The evidence was real. The children were better. The house was better. But help that goes on long enough starts to look like something else. Dependency. Entanglement. A situation that somebody somewhere was going to have to figure out. She finished hanging the laundry. She went inside. Lena was at the table working on her letters. Noah was napping. The kitchen was warm and smelled like the soup Mara had started before she'd gone out, and it looked the way a house looks when someone has taken care of it, which was the most heartbreaking thing she could have walked into right now. She stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment and looked at Lena bent over her letters, her tongue just visible at the corner of her mouth, the way it got when she was concentrating hard. "Mara," Lena said, without looking up. "How do you spell belongs?" Mara told her. She stood there in the doorway while Lena wrote it out, carefully, one letter at a time. That evening, after Gideon came in and supper was done and the dishes cleared, Mara went to the storage room that had become her room, and she took her traveling bag from under the pallet and set it on top. She didn't start packing, not yet. She sat on the edge of the pallet with the bag between her hands and looked at the wall. She'd made this decision before. She knew how to make it. You looked at the situation plainly without sentiment, and you assessed what was true. And what was true was this: she had no claim here. She was not family. She was not even, despite what Gideon had fumblingly tried to offer her, promised to anyone in this house. She was a woman who had stopped walking for a month and called it something it wasn't. She thought about what Harlan Coe had said on the boardwalk. Must be desperate taking that in. She thought about Mrs. Halper on her horse, and the thin woman at the Callaway boarding house, and every other person who had looked at her and seen the same thing. A woman who was too much, too large, too present, too loud in the room just by existing in it. Maybe they were right. Maybe the kindest thing she could do for this family was to stop imposing herself on it. She kept her hands around the traveling bag. Down the hall, she heard the particular creak of Noah's door, the small shuffling footsteps, and then his voice calling, still half asleep. "Mara?" She closed her eyes. "Coming," she called back. She put the bag aside. She got up. She went down the hall to where he was standing in his doorway, with his eyes barely open and his arms reaching, and she picked him up and carried him back to his bed and sat beside him until his breathing had evened out again. She sat there in the dark for a long time after. The bag was still there when she went back. She didn't touch it again that night. But she didn't put it away either. She left it on the pallet, packed and waiting, and she lay down beside it in the dark and listened to the wind working around the corners of the house. And she thought about belonging and whether it was something you could choose or something that had to be given to you, and whether the difference even mattered when you were sitting in the dark with a bag already packed beside you, and the sound of children sleeping down the hall. And she did not have an answer, not that night, and she did not sleep well, which was the most honest thing she could say about where she was. The bag sat on the pallet for 3 days before she touched it again. She hadn't meant for it to be 3 days. She'd meant to think through the night and decide in the morning, the way she'd always made decisions. Plainly, without dragging it out. Because dragging things out was a form of dishonesty she didn't have much patience for in herself. But the morning came and Noah needed his boot resoled where the seam had split, and she knew where the awl was and she knew how to do it, so she did it. And then there was the bread and the goats, and Lena had been struggling with a particular set of arithmetic problems that Mara had started working through with her in the evenings, and the evening passed, and she hadn't packed. The second day she told herself she was being weak, that the kindest thing, the genuinely kind thing, not the comfortable thing dressed up as kindness, was to leave before the children's lives organized themselves any further around her presence. She thought about this very clearly while she was straining the morning milk, and she thought she was right, and she fully intended to act on it. Then Lena came in from outside where she'd been collecting the eggs, a task she'd recently claimed as her own, conducting it with the territorial seriousness of someone who has found a job that suits them. And she set the eggs in the bowl on the counter and said, without preamble, "I found one that's speckled. It's different from the others. Do you think it still tastes the same?" "Break it and find out," Mara said. Lena broke it into a separate cup. She looked at it. "It looks the same inside." "Things usually do," Mara said. Lena looked at her. "What does that mean?" "It means the outside doesn't always tell you much about the inside." Lena considered this with the gravity she gave most things. Then she added the egg to the bowl with the others and went to wash her hands, and Mara stood there with the straining cloth in her hands and the perfectly sound logic of leaving dissolving somewhere in the middle of her chest. The third day she woke before dawn and lay in the dark with the bag there beside her and made herself look at it, made herself be honest about what she was doing. She was stalling, and she knew it, and she needed to stop. She sat up. She pulled the bag into her lap. She started folding the first of her spare dresses. She heard his voice in her head from that night 3 days ago. Not like this, not for that reason. Her own words, which she'd meant. She'd meant all of it. She didn't need Gideon's name. She didn't need Harlan Coe's approval. She didn't need any of it. What she needed, she was beginning to understand, was something she didn't have a clean word for. Something that was not the same as need at all, actually, because need implied desperation, and this was quieter than that, more ordinary. Just the specific pull of a particular house, a particular kitchen, 2 particular children, and a man who had started staying at the table after supper and whose eyes had something in them lately that hadn't been there a month ago. She kept folding. The coat went in. The second pair of stockings. The small tin with her needles and thread. The blue ribbon from the Callaway County Fair, which she picked up and held for a moment and then put in the bottom of the bag because it belonged there, because it was hers, because she'd earned it. She sat there with the bag half packed in the gray before dawn and heard the house breathing around her. The particular creak of the second floorboard in the hall. The sound of the wind finding the gap under the front door that she'd been meaning to stuff with rags. The goats, just audible from the barn, stirring. She knew this house. She had learned its sounds the way you learn a place when you've been paying attention. And she'd been paying attention since the first morning, had cataloged it without meaning to, without deciding to. It had just happened, the way your body maps a place you've been living in, the turns you stop thinking about because your feet already know them. She closed the bag and set it beside her and sat in the early dark. She would leave after breakfast. She'd make sure the children were fed and the morning chores done, and then she would say goodbye clearly, not sneak away, because she'd told Gideon she wasn't the kind of person who disappeared without warning, and she'd meant that too. She'd shake Gideon's hand because that was what the situation called for. Something formal that acknowledged what had happened here without making it harder than it needed to be. She would tell Lena to keep practicing her letters. She would tell Noah to keep looking for the apples. She would walk out of this house and she would not look back because that was the only honest way to do it. She got up and lit the lamp and went to start the fire. She was at the hearth, the kindling just catching, when she heard him. Not footsteps. Not a door. Just a sound, soft and low, from the direction of Noah's room. She thought at first he was talking in his sleep. He did that. Small, murmured conversations with whatever his 3-year-old mind was working through in the night. But the sound came again, and it wasn't sleep-talking. It was crying. The quiet kind, the kind a child does when they're trying not to be heard. She went to his room. He was sitting up in his bed in the dark, his blanket pulled around him, his face wet in the lamplight she carried in with her. He looked at her when she came through the door, and his face did the thing children's faces do when they've been trying to hold something together and someone they trust walks in. It crumpled all at once, the effort of it suddenly unnecessary. "Hey," Mara said. She sat on the edge of the bed. "What's wrong?" He shook his head, which meant something was wrong, and he either couldn't name it or didn't want to. "Bad dream?" she said. He shook his head again. She waited. She'd learned with Noah that waiting was usually more effective than asking, because he was 3, and the gap between his feelings and his language was still wide enough that you had to give him time to find the bridge across it. "You have your bag," he said finally. She went very still. "Saw it," he said. "When I went past your room. It was on your bed, all closed up." He looked at her with his face still wet, his eyes very serious. "You're leaving." She didn't lie to him. She couldn't do it, looking at his face. "I was thinking about it," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then, without saying anything, he reached out and put his arms around her neck. Not reaching for a hug, reaching the way small children reach when they're not asking, just holding on, and the weight of his small arms around her neck was the most uncomplicated thing she'd felt in days. She put her arms around him and held on back. "Don't go," he said, into her shoulder. Small and plain, and entirely without manipulation, the way only a 3-year-old can say a thing. Not a performance of need, just the fact of it. She sat there holding him, and her throat did what it did when she was trying to keep something down, and she breathed through it. "I'm here right now," she said. "Okay? I'm right here." She stayed with him until he fell back asleep, which took a while. She sat on the edge of his bed in the lamplight and listened to his breathing even out. Watched the tension go out of his small face, the way it does when sleep finally takes over, and she sat there a long time after, just sitting, not thinking about the bag in the next room or the road west or any of it, just being in the specific moment of this, which was Noah asleep and the house quiet and the first gray light starting at the window. She was still sitting there when she heard Lena's voice from the doorway. She turned. Lena stood in the hall in her nightgown, her hair loose, her feet bare on the cold floor. She looked at Mara with the expression she usually held in reserve, the one that was older than her face, the one that had been there since the beginning, that careful measuring look that Mara had spent the past month trying to find the thing underneath. She'd found it now. It was in Lena's face clearly, stripped of the careful management, just there. "I heard him," Lena said softly, nodding at Noah. "He's all right," Mara said. "He's asleep." Lena nodded. She stood in the doorway and didn't move, and Mara looked at her and saw the thing she'd been not seeing for 3 days, the thing she'd been packing around in her bag and carrying out the door. Lena, who had not cried at her mother's funeral, Gideon had told her this in one of his late evening fragments of honesty, that Lena had stood through the whole thing without making a sound, and that he'd been more worried about that than anything else. Lena, who had picked up her mother's wooden spoon and learned to stir the pot and learned to soothe her brother and learned to manage her father's silences, and had done all of it without ever asking to. Lena, who had let Mara in, who had stepped back from the basin and wiped her hands on her dress and put down, for the first time in months, the weight of being the person keeping things running. She stood in the doorway now, and she looked at Mara and she said, barely audible, just one word. "Stay." Just that. No argument before or after it. No pleas, no explanation. Just the word, said in Lena's voice, which was a child's voice trying to hold something too large for it. Mara felt it land in the center of her chest like something dropped from a height. She'd been bracing for a lot of things. She had not been bracing for that. She looked at Lena for a long moment. The lamplight was soft, and the house was almost completely quiet, and Noah was breathing in his sleep behind her, and she understood, standing there, that she had been wrong about something fundamental. She had been thinking about leaving as the responsible thing, the thing that protected these children from depending too much on someone who had no formal claim on them. She had been thinking that leaving was the less selfish choice, but she'd had it backwards. Leaving was the easier choice. Leaving was the choice that protected her from the risk of staying, from Harlan Coe and Mrs. Halper and every other person who had decided what she was before she'd opened her mouth, from the particular vulnerability of wanting something and not being certain you'd be allowed to keep it. Staying was the harder thing. Staying was the thing that required her to put the bag down and not pick it up again, and to stop running the calculus of whether she was too much, whether she took up too much space, whether the world's long insistence that she didn't fit anywhere might just, this once, be wrong. She looked at Lena. "Okay?" she said. Lena blinked. "Okay? Okay?" Mara said. "I'll stay." Lena stood there for another moment. She looked like a person who had said the bravest thing they'd ever said and was only now, in the aftermath, registering the size of what they'd done. Then she came into the room. She didn't hug Mara. Lena wasn't a hugger, not easily, not yet, but she came and sat beside her on the edge of Noah's bed, their shoulders nearly touching, and they both sat there looking at Noah asleep, and neither of them said anything else, because there wasn't anything else to say. She didn't hear Gideon until the morning. She'd been up since before dawn again. The decision made, the bag not touched, and she was at the hearth getting the porridge going when she heard him come down the hall and stop in the kitchen doorway. She could tell by the pause that he'd seen something in her face or her posture that told him something had shifted. "You didn't sleep," he said. "Not much," she said. He came in and poured himself coffee from the pot she'd set to heat earlier, and he stood with it and watched her stir. "Lena told me," he said after a moment. Mara looked at him over her shoulder. "She came and knocked on my door this morning," he said. She said she asked you to stay and you said okay." He stopped. "She said it like she needed me to know." Mara turned back to the porridge. "The bag," she said. "It's still in my room." "I figured." "I was going to leave," she said. "I want you to know that. I had it packed." "I know," he said. He said it quietly, and she could tell he'd known or suspected and had been sitting with it. "I should have said something, but I didn't know what to say that wasn't going to make it worse." "What would you have said?" He was quiet for a moment. She could hear him thinking, the way she'd learned to hear him thinking, the particular quality of his silence when he was working something out. "I would have said that what you called a burden isn't what I'd call it," he said. "And I know I gave you reason to think that. The way I—" He stopped, started again. "The way I said what I said the other night. I was trying to fix a problem and I made you into the problem by accident, and that was wrong." She stirred the porridge. "It did feel like that," she said. "I know." A pause. "I'm better at fixing fence posts than I am at—" He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Pretty much anything else." She looked at him then, over her shoulder again, and he was standing with his coffee and his worn wool shirt and his beard that was still more neglected than deliberate, and he looked like what he was, a man doing his best with tools that weren't quite up to the job. "You didn't fail anything," she said. "You were honest. It just landed wrong." He nodded. He looked into his coffee cup. "The children," he said after a moment. "What you are to them—" He stopped. He seemed to genuinely not have the words for what he was trying to say, which was unusual for him because he was a man who, when he chose to speak, usually knew exactly what he meant. "You don't have to say it," Mara said. "I want to." He looked up. "They've been surviving since their mother died, going through the motions of a day, one thing after another, just to get to the end of it. That's all any of us were doing. And then you came in and made it so they're actually—" He stopped again. "Living," he said. "That's the word. They're actually living now, and I don't know how to tell you what that means." The porridge was done. She moved it off the heat. She stood with the spoon in her hand and looked at the wall for a moment, because looking at him right now felt like too much. "I think," she said carefully, "that I forgot I was allowed to need something too." He didn't say anything to that. But she heard him set his coffee cup down, and she heard him cross the kitchen, and he came and stood beside her at the hearth. Not close enough to be anything it wasn't, just beside her. The way someone stands when they want you to know they're there. They stood there together while the fire snapped, and the house began to wake up around them. The creak of small footsteps in the hall, the particular sound of Noah's door, the murmur of the children's voices. And Mara put the spoon down and turned around and went to set the table. And Gideon went to the door to let some air in, and the morning opened up around them in its ordinary way. She unpacked the bag that afternoon. Not ceremoniously. She just went into her room after dinner while the children were napping and took the things out and put them back where they'd been. The coat on the peg. The stockings in the drawer she'd been given use of, the tin of needles on the small shelf, the blue ribbon. She held it for a moment, turning it over. She sat on the shelf beside the tin, in the open, where it could be seen. She sat on the edge of the pallet with the empty bag in her hands. She thought about what Lena had said, just the one word, in the dark of Noah's room, barely audible. Stay. Not please stay, or you have to stay, or any of the elaborate architecture children sometimes built around what they wanted. Just the word. Like the simplest possible statement of the simplest possible truth. She thought about her month here, the barn wall, and the cornbread, and the arithmetic, and the cold mornings, and the long evenings, and the kitchen that had slowly, stubbornly become something you could call warm. She thought about Gideon standing beside her at the hearth that morning, just standing there, and how that uncomplicated proximity had said something neither of them had found language for yet. She thought about this word home, which was a word she'd stopped using after the homestead went to Edmund's brother, had avoided with the particular superstition of a person who's been burned by something and learned not to reach toward the heat. She wasn't going to use it now. Not yet. She wasn't ready, and she'd learned to respect the difference between ready and not ready, because pushing that line was how people ended up in situations they couldn't stand behind. But she folded the empty bag and put it under the pallet, and stood up. And that was its own kind of answer. Outside, she heard Noah wake up from his nap with the particular brand of chaos he brought to waking. A thump, some shuffling, his voice asking a question she couldn't quite make out. And then Lena's voice answering, patient and older than it needed to be, and then both of them coming down the hall. The door to her room was open. Noah stopped in the doorway when he saw her, looked at the room, looked at the shelf, looked at her. "You unpacked," he said. "I unpacked," she said. He looked at the empty pallet, the coat on the peg, the shelf with the ribbon and the tin. He was working something out in his small, serious face. "So you're staying," he said. "For now," she said. And then, because he was 3 and for now was not a concept he was equipped to work with. "Yes, I'm staying." He considered this. Then he said, with the magnificent self-possession of a small child who has gotten what he needed and is now moving on to the next thing, "Can we have the soup again for supper, the kind with the beans?" "Yes," she said. "With the bread?" "If there's flour." "I'll check," he said, and turned around and went back down the hall. And she could hear him telling Lena, as he went, that they were having the soup tonight, reporting it with the confidence of someone who has resolved a major question and is ready to get on with living. Lena appeared in the doorway where Noah had been standing. She looked at Mara. She looked at the room. She didn't say anything, but she had the expression on her face that Mara had been waiting, without knowing she was waiting, to see. Not the old careful armor, not the managed steadiness of a child holding too much. Something softer, something that had come unstuck. "The flour's in the back of the larder," Lena said. "There's still some left." "Good," Mara said. "I'll make it with the bread then." Lena nodded. She started to turn away and then stopped. "Mara," she said. "Yeah." Lena looked at her with those 2 old eyes that were, just now, a little less old than usual. "I'm glad you stayed." Mara looked back at her. She didn't say "me too" because it felt too small for what she meant. She didn't say anything for a moment, and then she said, "So am I." Lena went back down the hall. Mara stood in her room with the empty bag under the pallet and the ribbon on the shelf and the sound of the children in the kitchen going through the larder with the focused energy of people who have decided that supper is the important thing right now, which it was, and the fire starting up in the hearth and Gideon's footsteps crossing the yard outside, coming in from the barn. She went to start the bread. She moved through the kitchen the way she'd moved through it every day for a month, finding what she needed without having to look for it, knowing where the bowls were, knowing how the Dutch oven sat on the trivet, knowing the exact amount of heat the hearth needed for bread versus the amount it needed for soup. The kitchen had the feel of a place that has been learned, and she moved through it without thinking. And that easiness was its own kind of thing, the kind you didn't notice until you stopped to notice it. Gideon came in from outside and stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her for a moment. "Soup tonight," Noah informed him from the corner where he'd apparently decided to sit and observe proceedings. "I can smell it," Gideon said. "And bread," Noah added. "Is there enough flour?" Gideon asked, directing this at Mara. Enough for tonight, she said. We'll need more from town by the end of the week. He nodded. He hung his coat and sat down at the table, and the kitchen filled up with the sounds of supper. The spoon on the pot, the children's conversation, the fire, the wind outside doing its work on the corners of the house. Ordinary sounds. Sounds that had become, without her quite registering when it happened, the sounds of a particular place at a particular time of day. She stirred the soup and listened to all of it, and she let herself, very carefully, not think about the road west or the boarding houses, or the thin woman at the desk, or Harlan Coe on the boardwalk. She let all of that go for right now, the way you set something down when your arms have been full too long, and she stood at the hearth in a kitchen that was warm and smelled like bread, and she was still. The ribbon sat on the shelf in her room, blue against the gray timber wall, the only bright thing in a plain space. She had earned it. She knew how to work with not much, not. And here, finally, tentatively, with no guarantees and no clean endings, and the full knowledge that tomorrow would bring its own complications, here was something. Winter came to the Mercer place the way it always came to that part of the country. Not with any particular announcement, just a morning when the water in the pump had frozen overnight and the sky had gone the flat white of a sheet hung out to dry, and you understood, looking at it, that the season had made its decision without consulting anyone. Mara was the one who discovered the pump. She'd gone out in the early dark as usual, her coat buttoned to the throat and her breath making small clouds, and she'd worked the handle for a full minute before she understood what was happening. She went back inside and told Gideon, and he said, "Already," in the voice of a man who'd been expecting it and still wasn't ready. And they spent the first hour of that morning thawing the line with hot water carried out in pots, which was a miserable and inefficient process that soaked Mara's boots through and left Gideon's hands red and stiff. By the time they got it working, Noah had appeared on the porch in his coat and hat to watch with the focused attention he brought to all mechanical problems. And Lena had started the porridge without being asked, which was something she'd been doing more often lately, not out of the grim necessity that had driven it before, but with the easy familiarity of someone who knows where things are and how they work and does them because it's just what you do in the morning. "It'll freeze again tonight," Gideon said, coming back inside and pulling off his wet gloves. "I know," Mara said. She was already by the hearth, her boots set near enough to the fire to dry without scorching. "We need to wrap the line before it gets dark. There's some old canvas in the back of the barn." He looked at her. Not the way he used to look at her, with that particular combination of distance and assessment that had characterized the first weeks, but the way a person looks at someone when what they've just said is exactly what they'd been about to say themselves. "Right," he said, "after breakfast." This was how most of their mornings worked now. Not smoothly. There was nothing smooth about keeping a frontier homestead running through a plains winter, and anyone who told you different was selling something, but with a kind of working rhythm that had developed over the months since September, a familiarity with each other's way of thinking that made the 100 daily decisions easier than they'd been when she first arrived. She had been here 4 months. It felt, in the way that some time does, like both longer and shorter than that. The brother arrived on a Thursday in early December, 3 days after the first real snow. His name was Caleb Mercer, and he was 2 years younger than Gideon and looked enough like him that you'd know they were brothers. But where Gideon was contained, Caleb was wide open, louder, quicker to express, quicker to decide, and possessed of a confidence in his own opinions that had clearly been with him his whole life. He rode in on a good horse with a bedroll and 2 weeks of provisions, because Caleb Mercer, as Mara would learn, never went anywhere without enough supplies to suggest he didn't entirely trust the situation he was riding into. Gideon had known he was coming. He'd gotten a letter 3 weeks prior and had told Mara about it with the particular careful tone he used when he was giving her information he thought she might need to prepare for. "He'll have questions," Gideon had said. "About me," Mara said. "Not a question." "He'll have questions in general. That's how Caleb is. He means well." "But," Gideon had looked at her, "but he has opinions about how things ought to go, about what's proper. Like Mrs. Halper." "Not like Mrs. Halper," Gideon said. "He's not mean about it. He just sees things a particular way and he's not always fast to revise." She'd filed this away and she'd been thinking about it ever since, in the background of her days. The way you think about a weather system you know is coming and can see on the horizon, but can't do much about except make sure the shutters are secure. Caleb rode in mid-afternoon when the snow had the hard glitter of cold sunlight on it and the temperature had dropped back below freezing. Noah saw the horse first and announced it with the enthusiasm of a child for whom any arrival is inherently exciting, and by the time Caleb tied up at the post outside, all four of them were at the door or the window. He came in and he shook Gideon's hand and then pulled him into the kind of rough, brief embrace that brothers who don't do it often manage when they've been apart a while. And he crouched down and said hello to Lena, who regarded him with her standard measuring look. And he picked Noah up and spun him once, which delighted Noah completely. Then he straightened up and looked at Mara. She looked back at him. "Caleb Mercer," he said. He extended his hand. His handshake was firm, and he held it a beat longer than necessary, which she recognized as an assessment. She let it happen. "Mara Whitlock," she said. "I've heard about you," he said. His voice was pleasant, giving nothing. "I expect you have," she said. That was all, that first evening. He was good company at supper. He had stories, and he told them well, and he made Gideon laugh twice in a way she hadn't heard before, a real laugh, short and a little surprised at itself. He talked to Lena about her letters and her arithmetic with the genuine interest of someone who liked children without performing it. He ate 3 helpings of the venison stew, which was the first venison of the season, Gideon having brought in a deer 2 days prior, and he said plainly that it was excellent. Mara said thank you and passed him the bread. She wasn't under any illusion that supper was the whole of it. She knew, and she was right, that the rest of it would come later. But somewhat? It came the next morning. She'd gone to the barn early, as she always did, to check on the goats and deal with the frozen water situation before the household was fully awake. She was working on the water trough, chipping the ice off the top and adding warmer water from the bucket, when she heard the barn door and looked up to see Caleb. He was dressed for the cold, his coat collar up, and he carried a second bucket which he set down without preamble and started filling from the barrel. They worked in silence for a few minutes. She appreciated that he didn't start talking immediately. It meant he wasn't entirely governed by impulse. "How long have you been here?" he said, when the immediate task was done and they were both standing there with nothing pressing to do with their hands. 4 months, she said. "Since September." "Yes." He looked at the goats, who were looking back at him with the complete indifference of goats. "And you were, what, traveling through?" "That's right." "And you stopped because of the children." "I heard Noah crying from the road," she said. "I came in and they hadn't eaten. I made a meal." "And stayed 4 months." "Yes." He was quiet. Outside, the wind moved snow off the barn roof in a soft cascade. He looked at her directly then, with the Mercer family trait of looking at you when they were actually looking at you. "I'm going to be straight with you," he said, "because I'd rather be straight than let things sit wrong between us." "I prefer that too," she said. "My brother's a good man," Caleb said. "He's had a hard time of it since Clara died. A bad hard time. Not the kind of hard time that improves someone, the kind that just costs them." A pause. "When I got his letter saying there was a woman living at the place, I'll tell you what I thought." "I can imagine," she said. "I thought he was lonely and someone had taken advantage of that," Caleb said. "That's what I thought. A stranger shows up, makes herself comfortable, and now she's in the house, and the children are attached, and it's going to be twice as bad when she leaves." Mara said nothing. She let him say it. It was fair. It was what any brother with sense would have thought. "But I was here last night," Caleb said, "and I saw the table and the food and the house and the way those children, especially Lena." He stopped. He looked away for a moment and his jaw moved. "Lena didn't laugh from September to March last year. Not once. I was there for Christmas and she didn't laugh once. She just managed. She managed everything and didn't laugh." He looked back at Mara. "She laughed twice at supper last night." Mara kept her face still. "I still don't know what to make of the situation," Caleb said. "I'll be honest about that too. It's irregular. People in town have said things." "I know what people in town have said," Mara said. "I don't think you're what they're saying," he said. "I want you to know that." He picked up his bucket. He looked at her one more time. "My brother doesn't talk about things easy. He never has. but I know him well enough to read what's in his face. And what's in his face right now is different from what was there before you came." He carried the bucket back toward the door. Then he stopped, with his back to her. "I'm sorry I came here ready to think the worst," he said. "That wasn't fair." He went out. The barn door swung shut behind him. Mara stood there in the cold and the goat smell and the thin winter light coming through the slats, and she held the empty bucket in her hands, and she thought about what it cost a person to say the thing they'd said wrong before they'd even been asked to. She thought it probably cost Caleb Mercer quite a bit, and she was grateful for it. He stayed 2 weeks, which was longer than he'd planned and long enough for the shape of things to become clear to anyone paying attention. He helped Gideon with the fence line on the north pasture, which had taken damage in the first serious snow. He fixed the porch step that Mara had patched months ago with lumber that had turned out not quite right for the job. He found better wood in the barn, cut it properly, and did it without comment, which was a kind of apology. He played some kind of elaborate invented game with Noah every evening that involved a lot of running between the furniture and regulations that changed depending on who was winning. He watched Mara. Not the way Harlan Coe had watched her, not with calculation or contempt. The way a person watches something they're trying to understand correctly. On the second to last day of his visit, she was teaching Lena her letters at the kitchen table when he came in from outside and sat down at the other end of the table with his coffee and didn't say anything. She finished the lesson. Lena was working on longer words now, words with more than one syllable, sounding them out with the deliberate focus of someone who has decided that reading is something she's going to conquer. And when Lena took her paper to practice on her own near the window, Caleb said, "She's good at it." "She is," Mara said. "She picks things up fast when she decides she wants them." "She's like her mother," he said. "Clara was like that." Mara looked at him. "Gideon doesn't talk about her much," he said. "To the children, I mean. I think he doesn't know how without—" He stopped. "It hurts him to bring her up, and it shows, and I think he worries about making it harder for them when they see that." "Lena knows," Mara said quietly. "She holds back from mentioning her mother because she's watching out for her father. She's been doing it since September." Caleb looked at Lena at the window, bent over her paper. 7 years old, he said. 6, when I got here, Mara said. He was quiet for a moment. "Does Gideon know she does that?" "I'm not sure. I think he suspects." Caleb set down his coffee cup. He had something on his face that was partly the expression of a man confronting something he should have noticed sooner, and partly something older. The particular grief of realizing that the people you love have been carrying things in silence because they didn't want to worry you. "Somebody should tell him," Caleb said. "Somebody probably should," Mara agreed. He looked at her. "Would you?" She thought about it. "I think it should come from you," she said. "You're his brother. Some things land differently coming from a person who's known you your whole life." He nodded slowly. He picked up his coffee again. "You're good at this," he said after a moment. Not flattery, observation. "At what?" she said. "Seeing what people need and figuring out who should be the one to give it." He paused. "Not a lot of people can do that without making it about themselves." She didn't say anything to that. She got up and went to check the soup on the hearth, and she heard him sit there a while longer before he finally went to find Gideon in the barn. She didn't know what was said in the barn. She didn't ask. But that evening at supper, Gideon said to Lena, quietly, in the way he said things that cost him, "Caleb was telling me about the time your mama tried to make a hat. Do you remember that?" Lena looked up. Her face went through something complicated. "The one that was supposed to be blue," Lena said. "It came out green," Gideon said. "She couldn't figure out why. Bought blue dye, did everything right. It came out green." "She wore it anyway," Lena said. Her voice was careful, but it was there. "She did," Gideon said. "She wore it to the Kavanaugh social and told everyone green was what she'd intended." Caleb said, "She told me the blue dye was defective and she was going to write a letter to the manufacturer." Lena looked between them. Something in her face had come loose in the way Mara had seen it come loose once before, in the dark of Noah's room. "Did she write it?" "I have no idea," Caleb said. "But I believe she meant to." Lena laughed. It was small, and it surprised her. Mara could see it, and she put her hand over her mouth the way you do when something comes out before you've decided to let it. And then she took her hand away and let it be there. the laugh, the memory, her mother's ridiculous green hat. And Gideon looked at her across the table with the look of a man who has just been given something he'd been afraid he'd never have again. Mara looked at her soup. She was not going to cry at the supper table. She had her standards. Caleb left on a Sunday, which was a cold, bright morning with the snow hard-packed and glittering. He tied his bedroll, saddled his horse, and said his goodbyes to the children with the rough affection that had been his manner with them throughout the visit. He shook Gideon's hand and held it a moment and said something quietly that Mara didn't hear and didn't try to. Then he came to Mara. He looked at her in his direct way. "You're good for them," he said. "All of them." He glanced briefly at Gideon and back. "All of them," he said again, with a slight emphasis that made it mean what he meant. "Take care of yourself out there," Mara said. He smiled, which was a good smile, easy and real. "I usually do." He mounted up and rode out through the gate, and Noah watched him go from the porch, and Lana stood beside Mara and watched too, and Gideon stood with his hands in his pockets and his shoulder close enough to Mara's that she could feel the warmth of it. She thought about what Caleb had said in the barn that first morning. "I was ready to think the worst." She thought about Mrs. Halper and Harlan Coe, and the woman at the boarding house with her tight smile. She thought about all the people who had seen her and decided, before she'd said a word, what category she belonged in. And she thought about this, Caleb riding out the gate having changed his mind, which was a harder thing than never having made the wrong judgment in the first place. She respected it more than she'd expected to. January was the hardest month, which was the way January usually went. The cold got serious about itself. 3 of the fence posts on the south line pulled out of the frozen ground and had to be reset, which took most of a brutal Thursday with the wind straight out of the north. The older of the 2 goats went lame, and they spent 2 anxious weeks hand-feeding her in a separate stall while she healed, which she eventually did, though not before Mara had spent more time thinking about a goat's recovery than she'd ever expected to spend on the subject. The flour ran out completely for 4 days when the supply wagon from town was delayed by drifted roads, and they made do with cornmeal in ways that became increasingly creative and eventually funny. Noah, for his part, took the flour shortage as a personal challenge. He stood at the counter beside Mara on the 3rd day, watching her work the cornmeal into something that could arguably be called flatbread, and he said, with the philosophical calm of a 4-year-old who has processed a problem and arrived at a solution, "We should grow our own wheat." "We should," Mara said. "Come spring." "I'll help." "You can plant the first row." He thought about this. What if the chicken eats it? "The chicken," Mara said, "will have to be managed." Noah looked out the window toward the barn with the expression of a small person accepting a difficult reality. "Margaret won't like that." "Margaret," Mara said, "does not get a vote on the wheat." He nodded gravely. This was fair. Lena, nearby at the table with a book Caleb had left behind. A proper book, stories, the kind she could almost manage on her own now, with occasional help, looked up from her reading and said, without looking at either of them, "We could put a fence around the wheat." "We're going to put a fence around the wheat," Mara confirmed. "Margaret will probably figure it out," Lena said, and went back to her book. These were the conversations that made up a winter. Small, sideways, full of the particular texture of people who know each other well enough to skip the preamble. They weren't significant individually. Together they were the whole of it, the thing that mattered, the thing she'd been looking for without knowing she was looking, from one end of the frontier to the other. Gideon asked her again in February. Not the way he'd asked before, not with his hands flat on the table and the careful, rehearsed quality of a man offering a practical arrangement. This was different. This was a Tuesday evening, after supper, after the children were in bed, and they were both at the kitchen table in the firelight with the particular easy quiet they'd gotten comfortable in. She was mending. She was always mending something. There was a limitless supply of things that needed mending in a household with 2 children and a working farm. And he was doing the accounts, which he did once a week with a pencil and a look of concentration that was slightly pained because the numbers were tight and he knew it and she knew it. He looked up from the accounts. He looked at her for a moment without saying anything. She felt it and looked up. "I'm going to say something," he said, "and I want you to let me finish before you say anything." She set down the mending. "Last time I asked you," he said, "I asked you for the wrong reasons. I asked you because people were talking and I wanted to fix it, and I made the whole thing sound like you were a situation that needed solving, and you were right to say no." He paused. "So I'm going to ask you again. Different reasons." She said nothing. She'd promised to let him finish. "You've been here 5 months," he said, "and I know what this house was before you came into it. I know what it was, and I know what it is now, and the difference is not the mended curtains or the fixed barn wall, though those things matter. The difference is—" He stopped. He looked like a man who has come to the edge of something and is deciding whether to step off it. "The difference is that I want to get up in the morning," he said. "I didn't before. I got up because the children needed me to, and that was the whole of it. But now I want to, and I know the reason." The fire ticked. Outside, the February wind ran itself against the walls of the house and found them solid. "I'm not asking you to take my name because it'll fix the talk in town," he said. "I'm asking because I want you here, not because the children need you, though they do. Because I do." He stopped again. "I'm not good at this. I know I'm not good at this." "Yeah, you're doing all right," she said. "I'm asking you to marry me because I'd like to spend the rest of my life in the same house as you," he said. "That's all. That's the whole reason." She looked at him across the table. She thought about September, the road west from Millhaven, the gray farmhouse behind the scrub, the door opening 3 inches to show her Lena's serious face. She thought about the ribbon in her coat pocket and the long walk and every door that had closed and the particular arithmetic of her life up to that point, which had seemed to add up to a clear answer about where she belonged. She'd been wrong about the arithmetic. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Gideon," she said. "Yes." Something moved through his face. Not dramatic, not the kind of expression that would be easy to describe to someone who hadn't been watching him for 5 months. Just a quieting. The way a face looks when something that's been braced against something else finally, carefully, lets go. "All right," he said. And then he laughed, short and a little surprised at itself, the same way she'd heard him laugh when Caleb was here. "You have to stop saying that like it resolves everything," she said. "Does it not resolve things?" "It resolves some things," she said. "Then, all right," he said. She shook her head. She picked up the mending. She was smiling, which she wasn't trying to stop. They were married in March, when the ground had started to think about thawing, and the light had shifted from the flat white of deep winter to something with a little warmth in it. The ceremony was small, a traveling judge who came through Haskell on circuit, 2 witnesses, the children. Lena wore her best dress and held Noah's hand and watched the proceedings with the focused attention she brought to things she understood were important. Noah asked, partway through, whether the judge's hat was a special hat or a regular hat, and had to be redirected by Lena in a whisper. When it was done, they all had the soup. The bean and salt pork soup, which had been the first thing Mara had ever cooked in this kitchen, and which she'd made deliberately, as a kind of private acknowledgement that some things come full circle. Gideon had looked at the pot on the hearth when she was making it, and she'd seen him understand, and he hadn't said anything, just put his hand briefly on her shoulder as he passed, which was its own kind of language. Mrs. Halper sent a cake. This surprised everyone, including, Mara suspected, Mrs. Halper. It was a good cake, dense with dried fruit, the kind of thing that takes real effort. Mara wrote her a note that evening, thanking her plainly, and she meant every word of it. Harlan Coe said something in the feed store, according to a report Gideon brought home the following week, that was dismissive and small and told you everything you needed to know about what kind of man Harlan Coe was at his core. Mara heard about it, nodded once, and did not spend another minute on it. She had learned over a long and frequently difficult 34 years that some people's opinions were worth the effort of caring about and some people's were not, and the ability to tell the difference was one of the most useful things she'd figured out. Spring came the way it always did in that country. Not with any ceremony, just a gradual loosening, the earth going soft. The first pale shoots in the kitchen garden that she and Lena tended on a Sunday morning with their sleeves rolled up and their hands in the dirt. Noah, true to his word, planted the first row of wheat with a seriousness that was entirely appropriate to the occasion, and then stood back and looked at the turned earth with the expression of a person who has done a significant thing. "Now what?" he said. "Now we wait," Mara said. He considered this. "For a long time," Yes. Can we check on it? We can check on it. He nodded, satisfied with this arrangement. He went to check on the chicken, Margaret, who was watching the proceedings from the other side of her fence with the expression of an animal that suspects she is being outmaneuvered. It was on a Sunday evening in late April when Lena asked the question. They were all at the table, all four of them, the supper dishes cleared and the lamp lit against the early evening and the first real warmth of the year coming through the window that Mara had opened an inch. Gideon was reading. She was working on Lena's letters, though Lena needed less help now, could get through most things on her own with the occasional word she hadn't encountered before. Noah was drawing something on his slate, an elaborate structure of lines that he'd informed them was a barn for Margaret, which was more grace than Margaret had earned. Lena put down her pencil and looked at Mara. "If you stay forever," she said, "do you become our mother?" The table went very quiet, not uncomfortably, just the way things go quiet when something has been said that needs a moment of space around it. Mara looked at Lena. Lena looked back with those eyes that had started the year too old and were slowly, incrementally, becoming the eyes of the 7-year-old she actually was. She thought about Clara Mercer, who had worn a green hat and told everyone she'd meant it to be green, who had shown Lena how to make cornbread and how to braid her own hair and all the 100 things a mother teaches a daughter that the daughter carries forever without always knowing she's carrying them. She thought about what it would mean to claim a word like mother in the shadow of a woman who had earned it completely. She thought about all of this in the second or two of silence before she answered, and then she thought about something else. That belonging is not a fixed thing, not a category with only one occupant. That love does not work the way property does. That Lena had held her mother's memory with such careful devotion that she had been afraid for months to laugh in case it meant she was forgetting. And she was still here. Clara was still here. And the green hat story, and the cornbread recipe, and the way Lena's face went when she was concentrating hard, tongue at the corner of her mouth. That wasn't going anywhere. "I don't know what word you want to use," Mara said. "That's something you get to decide, not me." She looked at Lena steadily. "What I can tell you is that I'm here, and I'm not leaving, and whatever word you need for that, it's yours to use." Lena looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at Gideon. Gideon had put down his book. He reached across the table and put his hand over Mara's. He didn't say anything. He just let it sit there, his hand over hers, in the lamplight. In the open air of the kitchen they'd all learned to live in together. Noah looked up from his slate. He looked at the hands. He looked at Mara. "Can Margaret come in?" he said. "No," said all three of them at the same moment, and Lena laughed, clean and easy and entirely unguarded, the laugh of a child who does not need to hold it back anymore. And the sound of it filled the kitchen and went out through the open window into the April evening, and Mara felt it in her chest like the first warm morning after a winter that had gone on too long. She sat at that table in a house that had been a hollow, gray, barely surviving thing when she first walked into it, and she thought about the road from Millhaven and the ribbon in her coat pocket and every door that had said no. She thought about what it had cost her, all of it, the years of it, and she thought about whether she'd trade any of it, and she found, sitting there with Gideon's hand over hers and Lena still laughing and Noah returning to his architectural plans for Margaret's barn, that she wouldn't. Not because the hard parts had been worth it in some clean, redemptive way. The hard parts had just been hard, and some of them had been genuinely unfair, and she didn't have to call them anything better than what they were. But they had made her the person who could walk into that kitchen in September and know what to do. Who could recognize a child holding too much and know to step back from the basin. Who could hear a 3-year-old say, "Don't go in the dark," and know what it cost him to say it. You don't get to choose your beginning. You get to choose, over and over, in the 100 small moments that don't feel like choices at the time, what kind of person you're going to be inside whatever circumstances you're handed. That was the only thing she'd ever truly known how to do, and she had done it, and here was the result of it. A table with 4 people around it, and a lamp, and an open window, and spring coming in. She was 34 years old. She had a blue ribbon from a county fair on a shelf in her room. She knew how to work with not much. It turned out not much, if you worked it right, could become more than enough. Outside, the evening settled over the Mercer place. The garden just waking up, the wheat rows Noah had planted straight and serious in the south plot. The barn where the goats were already quiet for the night. The fence posts Gideon and Caleb had set straight in the hard January ground. The cottonwoods along the creek had their first leaves, small and pale green, barely there, the kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't paying attention. Mara was paying attention. She had learned on a long road between places that didn't want her that the world is not generally arranged in your favor, and that this is neither a reason to stop nor a reason to be bitter about it. Just a condition, like cold weather, that you dress for and work around and sometimes, on the right day, find yourself standing on the other side of. This was the other side. It was not perfect. The flower situation would recur. The chicken would continue to resist any attempt at reasonable management. Gideon would have mornings when he was somewhere else entirely, and she would learn to let him be there until he came back. And he would. Lena would grow up and become complicated in the ways that people become complicated, and she would need things that Mara knew how to give and things that she didn't, and they would figure it out as they went. Noah would build increasingly ambitious architectural projects for Margaret, none of which would be structurally sound. None of it would be smooth. It never was, and she'd stopped expecting it to be. But the lamp was lit, the window was open. Lena was laughing. Mara stayed.